I guess as good a place as any to start. I finished reading your book, Walking Through the Fire, on Wednesday, and the place I was kind of hoping to start with was something you talked about in chapter 16. You talk about going to the state capitol in Des Moines to try and discuss a concern that you had with the state senator, and you noted in the book that you pretty quickly realized that the state senator wasn't really listening to you, wasn't paying attention. And so I was kind of curious about your specific reason for including that anecdote in the book, and if you think that a major problem in politics today is that a lot of people don't feel like they're listened to or heard from their representative.
Well, I was sure that I was not being heard. And, it's actually, my memory isn't real clear on what the issue was, but I remember that it was a non-controversial. It should have been a no-brainer. And I wasn't getting any response. And these are the people that were elected to represent me and all the other Iowans. And if the system doesn't work any better than that, then we needed new people. So I reached a high level of frustration with that. I'm running a business, and I took a day out to go down there to try to be heard, and I wasn't heard. And there were a couple other incidents along the way that aren't in the book that also added to that. I mean, it was a series of experiences, but that one was a catalyst that I thought, that's it. I'm going to go home and I'm going to recruit somebody to run for state senate. And I just remember driving home and thinking about it all the way home. And I set about on that mission. And of course, the result of it was I ended up being the candidate.
Yeah. And so do you think a lot of other people have frustrations like that when it comes to interacting with government officials?
Well, I'd hope not, but I sure think it's true. That was one of the reasons why I always wanted to be very, very responsive to all of my constituents. That I don't want them to ever think that government's not there trying to do the best they can to, within the law, help people and help their lives. And so that's why when I ended up in Congress with a staff that hovered around 17 or 18, every one of them knew that we were there to help people. And that's the one thing that I miss the most. I miss my staff. I guess it's the second thing I miss so much, is not having the tools to help people as much as we had been for 18 years in Congress.
And for someone then who hasn't read your book, what would you kind of say is the central thesis of it?
Well, the central is the breadth and the depth of the swamp. I just don't think people can see it from where they sat. I couldn't see it even from where I sat until that whole thing unfolded on me. And that's why I was so careful to write it without sour grapes being a component of it, and still chronologically so people could follow what happened, and footnote it with the details and the pictures that are in there to let people know these are the facts. And it's been carefully vetted, but the breadth and depth of the swamp and how something like that can take place. I was just elected to Congress, and I was the only surviving Republican in the Iowa delegation, by the way, and my own party started maneuvering against me. Well, what were the reasons for that? Was it logical? Why wasn't there a single statesman in the bunch that stepped up and said, wait a minute, what about the facts of this? Don't you think we should talk to Steve King and see what he says? Every one of them had my cell number, and no one did.
So yeah, and that's an issue that's obviously discussed at length in your book, is your removal from your committees in 2019 following the New York Times interview, and then your subsequent loss in the 2020 primaries. And the language you have for some of the folks involved in all of that isn't exactly generous. I think that's fair to say. You called Randy Feenstra, an off-the-shelf state senator. Kevin McCarthy got narcissistic abuser, and you said he's equally as devious and adept as Liz Cheney, who you said would have gladly shoved the stiletto between your ribs if given the chance. And I'm wondering, when you were writing some of that, did you think any of that was a shade too harsh, or do you think that all of those characterizations are fair from your perspective?
I thought I was too gentle, honestly and objectively. I thought I was too gentle with them, given what they had done. And some of it I didn't want to write because it doesn't reflect well on the Republican Party, which I have been so invested in for a long time. But I couldn't write the story without telling the truth. And I couldn't I don't know if maybe there were some more gentle terms there, but it would have taken a long time to explain it. And you would have gone to sleep before you got the message. But I've always used language that send the message. And I didn't think I was being harsh with Randy Feenstra at all. I mean, I know that they were recruiting candidates the previous time in 2016. He was about number 5 on their list of candidates that they tried to recruit. And I knew exactly what that message was and what they were trying to do. I don't know where he was on this list now, but he took the bait. And so I don't know how you describe it any more gently than off the shelf. And but then with Liz Cheney, she's it is you just watch her today, and you can see that I didn't come hard enough against her, given what you're seeing happen with her today. And then with Kevin McCarthy, if I didn't put this in the book, but if there was a mistake that I made along the way, I don't take back any words or any actions, but I did not discern the cunning of Kevin McCarthy until it was too late. And that was within about 2 weeks before the primary election when I actually knew the deviousness of Kevin McCarthy. So I want people to know that, what power does to corrupt people. And if people ask me, well, what do you want people to do that have been named in this book? And I said, some of them I've helped from the very beginning and helped put them in the places they are today. They didn't seem to have any loyalty to that. But I would say, what do I want them to do? Go back to being the decent people that I thought you were before you began perpetrating these kind of things.
I was curious in reading some of the passages, especially kind of you go point by point later on in the book with some of your interactions with Kevin McCarthy, especially after you got taken off of your committees. And I was kind of wondering just when is the last time you had a conversation with him? Because it seemed like you had trouble reaching him during that period. And so I was just wondering, when was the last time you even talked to Mr. McCarthy?
Well, I don't know that we certainly didn't have a private conversation after that. And I don't know that I've had one with him after that, because we were thrown into the COVID quarantine and people had to wear masks and show up in cycles and to vote. And of course, not having any committees, that didn't help either. But we didn't have conference either. That was done remotely. So I can't say that I've had a meaningful conversation or even an incidental one with Kevin McCarthy since this happened. But no amount, if I had gone to confront him, it wasn't going to change anything. The die was already cast. So I set about doing the best I could to serve my constituents, and I knew I was walking through the rest of this term when that happened.
At this point, would you still like to have a conversation with him about all of this, or do you think that would be beneficial at all?
Kevin McCarthy is too much of a narcissistic abuser to confess. I'm certain of that. And so I don't know that there would be good that would come from that. But if other people want to read my book and talk to Kevin McCarthy, that would please me a great deal.
Someone else you brought up in the book was, and this was early on in the book, was former Governor Terry Branstad. And you said, quote, "I confess to taking pleasure knowing how glum our happiness made Branstad and his deep-pocketed allies watching TV at their quote-unquote victory parties." And so I was kind of curious, and for people who might not have read the book, what is your specific beef there when it comes to former Governor Branstad?
Well, when Terry Branstad made the promise that he wouldn't endorse a candidate for president as a seated governor in Iowa, I understand that, and there was nothing wrong with that decision. In fact, it probably was the best decision that he could have made. But he kept his word technically. But when he came out and said anybody but Cruz, he put the Iowa's First in the Nation caucus at great, great risk, greater than we had seen throughout the whole course since 1976 when this began. And it's because if he had succeeded in killing off Cruz's campaign, if Cruz would have finished second or lower, everybody would have pointed to that and said, Terry Branstad destroyed Ted Cruz's campaign here in Iowa. If he had succeeded in that, then no candidate would come to Iowa and we wouldn't be First in the Nation caucus anymore, because they would fear a governor could kill off their candidacy. They could spend a year out here, as Rick Santorum gave 385 speeches across Iowa and won the Iowa caucus. They wouldn't show up at all. And that means that the Iowa values that we put into the Oval Office embodied in Donald Trump would not be there again. And I don't want to see this country taken over by the East or West Coast. I think the right values come from the heart of the heartland, and that's right here. And it's a precious jewel for us to hold here in Iowa. And no one put it at greater risk than Terry Branstad, and that offends me.
You talk about some more of the 2016 election stuff in chapter 7 of your book. And something I was kind of trying to parse was you talk about former President Trump, and you also say that part of the reason the media coverage of you was the way it was because of your consequential role in the presidential nomination process. And what I was wondering about with that is you supported Senator Ted Cruz in the run-up to the Iowa caucuses. And of course, he won in Iowa, but he didn't end up winning the nomination. And so I was curious why you seemed to think then that you were being targeted for your consequential role as it relates to the nomination process.
Well, it's been many times flowing out through the media during that time that a lot of people said, well, I was Trump before Trump. And it's related to especially Trump's immigration policy, which reflects my immigration policy. And there's a narrative in there that tells the story about how when he had said in an Oval Office meeting with myself and about 5 other members of Congress that he had raised more money for me than anybody else. And I said, Mr. President, I market tested your immigration policy for you for 14 years. That should be worth something. And that was good for a laugh, too. That was a relationship that we developed, and it reflects that, which is why I told that narrative. But it was as if I think it's also just a given that if I had not stepped up and been the national co-chair of Ted Cruz's campaign in Iowa, that he would not have won Iowa. And in that case, would it have been Trump? Most likely, as we look back on it now. But I had told Donald Trump that on the day that I endorsed Ted Cruz, if you come out of this thing with a nomination, I'm all in for you. So we built that relationship along the way. But that's the influence. I'll just say it, I put it this way, is that my involvement in the Iowa caucus from 1996, I was behind Pat Buchanan. We were assigned 28 counties. Buchanan won 24 of those 28 counties. And then as you go through the 96, 2000, 2008, 12, and 16, each one of those I had more and more influence on the nomination process, not only in Iowa, but I was going to places like New Hampshire and South Carolina. They saw all that, and they saw that I had launched the national campaign on February 24th of 2015 with David Bossie in a Freedom Summit, where we had 11 or 12 presidential candidates there in Des Moines, along with several others that were looking at running for president. We set up an event that had tremendous amount of impact, and it also brought those ideas into the funnel of full spectrum constitutional Christian conservatism. And they fear that kind of influence. So I don't think it's overstated at all.
In the previous chapter to that one, in chapter 6, you credited your dad as one of the main reasons you're, as you said in your words in the book, quote, the one to crawl farthest out on the limb of controversy. And so I was curious, how did the way that your dad interacted with you kind of lead you to embrace that limb of controversy, as you called it?
Well, can you give me a little bit more on that question? It doesn't quite focus me right.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering how, like, the way that your dad engaged with you, did that kind of influence you to go out into more controversial waters and sort of embrace that in some ways? Well,
okay, I don't know that it would encourage me to go into controversial waters so much as it did that it was very rigid on principle, and so as he drilled that into me at the kitchen table, we'd be talking about the rule of law and the Constitution, and he would have the Code of Iowa sometimes at the kitchen table after supper at night, lecturing from it and tying it into the Constitution. So he drilled it into me from I'll say young enough to begin to understand on up that there's a structure here, the legal structure, and you have to revere this Constitution. The foundation of it is biblical thinking. The Bible was on the end table in the living room, but the other stuff came to the supper table. So he drilled that into me, and he said, "Here's the Constitution. It is the supreme law of the land. The rest of the laws are written within the framework of this Constitution, all the way down through the state and the local levels and ordinances." And your options are this: you can abide by these laws, or if you disagree, then you can go lobby your legislator or run for office. Those are your choices, and you have no other choices. So that focused me from a boy on up on what our duties were as our civic responsibilities was to make sure this structure stays in place, that it's sound, that we respect the rule of law, and that we amend it according to the needs we have within our principles of morality.
And then kind of getting into at least a couple of those controversies, some of which you talk about in the book, and you annotate them in the back. One I was kind of curious about was in one of the early chapters, you mentioned David Duke, who, if people don't know, was in the KKK. And you have an aside about him where you say, quote, "I am convinced he is being subsidized by the left to create mischief for the right." And I was kind of curious, why do you think that, and what proof do you think there is of that?
Well, I'd just say that was a tongue-in-cheek, written in tongue-in-cheek tone. And because he's, they trot David Duke out constantly and try to paint any conservative Republican as somehow having an association, affiliation, or an ideology that might reflect David Duke's. And they do that because David Duke's the only Republican that we can think of. And I think he's a former Republican now. I'm not certain of that, though. But there's a whole lot of people in the Democratic Party that, if you want to talk about the KKK, it's been all the Democratic Party from the very beginning. And David Duke is an exception, so they use him, and the use of him has, because of the existence, they've used him, and that has damaged many conservative Republicans and caused them to be afraid to speak up. And of course, I've never been afraid to speak up. That's more important, and it's more important today than it's ever been, as I can see.
What do you think that specific fear is then? Because obviously, I think David Duke is someone most people could agree is a pretty loathsome figure. So should people on your side of the aisle really be that afraid to speak about these kind of things?
No, they shouldn't. And but what happens is that the press, and I'm speaking generally across the country, the press and Democrats will label anybody that says that defends our culture and our civilization and disagrees with them. They'll tie David Duke to them, and then. And so what I've seen is that, I've come out and defended a good number of things, and I see my conservative friends from the South just deathly afraid of any issue that has to do with race. They won't talk about it. They'll run and hide from it. They want their conservative credentials, but they've been painted so many times, they won't address the issue. And if it's important, I will address the issue. And that's caused them, of course, to target me. So I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but I just consider David Duke. I've never met him. I know very little about him. Probably mostly anything I know about him is because the press wrote negative attacks on me and tied his name to it. And that hasn't even happened that often, a couple times that I can think of.
In chapter 11, speaking of race, you list off what you consider one-word slurs, and you included in that racist. And I was curious, again, why you sort of think that the word racist is a slur.
Why I think it's a slur?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I don't think there's any question. That's the most damaging slur that they have used over and over again, but it's worn out now. And so they had to come up with new pejorative words to weaponize. But, what I'm trying to think, is there something worse that you can label someone with than the word racist? I can't think of it. In our culture today, that's just very clear. And if it sticks, it's the most damaging thing that they can say and do.
I think some people would say there are specific racial and ethnic slurs there that are just as harsh, if not more so.
Can you tell me a few of those? Because I can't think.
I'm not necessarily comfortable using some of those, but certain
I know
4-letter words, F words, of course.
Okay. Yeah, and I of course won't use them either, but they don't get used for that very reason. But the term racist gets thrown out constantly, and in fact, there's a part in my book that Brett Hume talks about my quotes. That there was a whole string of quotes that were written into an article by the New York Times. Brett Hume took those all apart, and he said, most of them had nothing to do with race. And there was nothing about them that were racist statements. He said, it's all bogus. It's bogus. And I do put that in my book. And Britt Hume, by the way, I don't think I put it in there, but he's been public that he's no Steve King fan. But he defended me on that. And he said that the word racism has been hurled about with abandon, and it's a very specific thing. And he described what racism means to him. I can't tell you from memory, but of course, it's somebody that thinks that there's a distinction between people as far as their God-given abilities is concerned, and I don't believe that. I believe that there's distinctions between cultures and civilizations, and we need to respect that. But I've said this in quotes multiple times, and this is in the book, I believe, that if a baby is born anywhere in the world, then you lift them out of that cradle and put them into a cradle here in an American family that's assimilated into the American civilization. That baby will grow up to be as American as any other. The babies, that's what happens. But once you give them 25 years steeped in another culture, they don't assimilate so well. They can, and they will, and they do, unless they are so focused into an ethnic enclave that they don't get out of that bubble. And that's a problem that exists all over Europe. Ethnic enclaves, silos of enclaves, they call it. And it's a problem that is growing here in the United States, too.
So I had a question about that. There's a quote that you had in chapter 9 where you said, quote, immigrants depend on the advice of politically compromised leaders who are happy to tell them how to vote. And I was kind of curious about that phrasing, especially depend and happy to tell them how to vote. How does that differ from someone saying immigrants can't think for themselves?
Well, I could go into further detail of this, but when you have especially illegal aliens that come into the United States in violation of the law, they're nurtured by a number of NGOs. And I saw this first when I had drafted the English as the official language legislation in the state Senate. And you had the people that objected the loudest were often like, I'll say numbers, the names don't come to mind for me now. It's been a lot of years, but it'd be a white man who speaks Spanish. And he would be the one speaking for the cluster of those folks that didn't speak English very well. And he would be irate. And what I learned was, what I discerned from this was that his power base was the people that he could communicate to. And if I could communicate to them directly, he lost his power base. And also we had the opportunity then for a broader assimilation. The people that have come against me on that don't want assimilation. They want enclaves, and they want to be able to control the people in those enclaves. And that's destructive to the American civilization. We need to be able to flow back and forth with each other and appreciate our neighbors and do business with each other, go to church with each other, integrate ourselves, assimilate ourselves, but integrate ourselves all together. And I see that resistance pushing back on that from especially the voices, the spokesmen of the minorities that have not yet assimilated into our culture. So that's one of the examples, and I've seen it over and over and over again for years. I'm fully confident that I've got this analyzed correctly.
If there's a concern about that particular aspect of politically compromised leaders, as you talked about, sort of holding those folks under your sway, which is how you were sort of describing it, isn't at least one anecdote to that to reach out to those specific folks yourself, so that politically compromised leaders aren't the ones doing it? Wouldn't that be a way to get them maybe thinking for yourselves from the way you're framing things?
Well, I've done that on multiple occasions, and it's been part of the strategy that I've reached out with. So, in fact, well, I better not go into the detail on that, given that there's people and personalities that reserve their privacy. But we made a concerted effort to do that outreach, and I will say that what happened when this all came down on me in January of 2019, I was surprised that conservative blacks were asking for meetings and coming to my office, and that they understood what I was going through. It took me a while to figure out, well, they had also been through a similar thing. They'd been tested by the broader circle of Congressional Black Caucus type people. And as they stood as conservatives defending their convictions, they had been ostracized by their own people. And so, for example, Diamond and Silk made several trips into my office, and I did what I could to help them, of course. There were others along the way. Kay Cole James, the former president of the Heritage Foundation, asked for a meeting, and we had a terrific sit-down discussion. She understood what was going on too. So that's mostly the conservative blacks. The Hispanics, that didn't materialize in those kind of numbers. But let's see, there's one other component of that, if I can remember what it was. Oh yes, Hispanic, Hasidic Jews. When a Hasidic Jewish rabbi makes a trip down from New York City to let me know that he knows I'm not an anti-Semite, that speaks to me. But the people that had conservative ideologies have been marginalized in each of those categories that I've mentioned here. And I've always tried to empower them as much as I can.
I was curious too, along these similar lines, later on in the book, you have a chapter where you talk about DACA and you talk about the Dreamers. And I was wondering, in reading those passages, should the Dreamers who are, valedictorians and upstanding citizens be allowed to stay in the country? You made your views clear about any of the folks who have committed crimes, whether or not they should be allowed to stay. But I was curious, what about those ones that, are valedictorians or, actually do contribute to society? Should those folks also get the boot, or what should become of them?
The short answer is yes, because the rule of law is far more important than the individuals that we're talking about here. They've all broken the law. Some of them didn't know it. I will say most of them did know. But so I'm saying this, that yes, they all have to go home. And if we don't do that, then we've established amnesty. And amnesty is a magnet that brings more and more. And it's never going to end as long as we reward the people that break our laws. But I have written on this, and I made an extensive proposal that, I don't know how far back that would be. I'd have to dig it out of my archives, but it's maybe a couple years old, no older than that, I don't think, 3 at the most. And I start with I better not tell the whole story because we don't have time for it all, but I'll just say this. The foundation of the Peace Corps began in the Philippines about the time that we went in there. So 1903, right in there, we had 72 Thomasites. Thomasites came on the ship, the USS Thomas. They called them Thomasites. They were teachers. They set up the educational system in the Philippines. Only 72 of them. And 100 years later, Gloria Arroyo, then president of the Philippines, gave a speech in Washington, D.C., thanking America for what they did there. They established English as the language, the common language in the Philippines. They established the educational system. They built the schools, put the administration in place, the teachers. And by the time World War II broke out, the Thomasites were all gone, and they had handed it all over to the Filipinos, who had adopted the American way. And that allowed then for the Filipinos with language skills and a good education to travel anywhere in the world to work, and they sent their money back to the Philippines. But that's if 72 Thomasites can do that in the Philippines, think what a lot of dreamers could do if they went back to their home country for 5 years and wait 5 years before they could apply to come back into the United States legally. And in the process of that, be like Peace Corps workers, they'd be bilingual. They have familiar relationships within their home country, and the economies of those countries would just grow by leaps and bounds. They'd have an American education that was paid for by American taxpayers, but this would be the most powerful economic growth system that's ever been built in the world. And it would be, I think, even more powerful than the Marshall Plan in Europe if we took all that human capital and said, go fix your home country and then come back and then apply to come back to the United States after a specified period of time. And I'm suggesting 5 years.
I've seen this kind of argument and line of thinking from people before, sort of asking, why should folks in this particular case have to wait that length of time when people in the past didn't necessarily wait that length of time? Most of my ancestors are Irish, as my last name McNett would kind of note. They didn't necessarily wait to get here. They, came in when they could on boats and everything like that. And so what would you say to that, of why should folks have to wait now for so many years when that wasn't always necessarily the case in the past?
So generally speaking, your Irish ancestors, and there must be some Scots back there too in your ancestry, but they came there with the immigration laws had not been written at that point. And so they weren't in violation of the law, generally speaking. But today, and the law since the current immigration laws have been passed, this would either be about 1964 or the mid 90s, whichever one of those legislation that were there. There's a 10-year bar. If you come into the United States illegally, and then you're deported by law, and you have to wait 10 years to come back into the United States of America. You can apply, and you get after that 10-year period of time. That's why I'm suggesting we cut that time in half. By the way, if the Dreamers are going to go back home and become the equivalent of Peace Corps workers in their home countries, or their choice of a country for that matter, they've got to have some time to contribute in their home country, and to take the educational gifts that they have from us and apply them in the economic development and the social development system of where they grew up, most likely. I think that's, if you said you don't have to wait, then you're just granting them amnesty anyway. And what I'm proposing here is, it's a great big idea, but hardly anybody knows even the story about the Philippines. And I can ask Peace Corps workers, what's the origin of the Peace Corps? They can't go back to the Thomasites. They just don't know about it. So I was just stunned when I drilled into this thing to see how much difference those 72 Thomasites made as compared to the foreign policy that we have today. That probably was the very best single investment in foreign policy that we've ever made in the world, in the history of our country, is the Thomasites. And then it was John F. Kennedy that picked up the idea of the Peace Corps workers, and that's done a lot of good. And nobody really balks at appropriating money for the Peace Corps workers. They are ambassadors wherever they are.
I had to ask about this quote too from page 113, professional investment in this one. You said, reporters used to be regular Janes and Joes. Many had no college experience at all, but they had a much better feel for the struggles of real people than do the pampered inhabitants of today's newsrooms. And I was curious, what newsrooms were you referring to there? Because at least in my experience, I haven't been in a single newsroom in a smaller town, which is mostly where I've worked in newsrooms, that reflects that description.
I think a small town, that's probably not going to be reflected there. And but the elitists end up in places that, Columbia University degrees, and they end up in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times and beyond. So, and I interacted with those people for all of 18 years on a daily basis. So you just pick that up along the way, and you can tell by the questions that they ask, how are they anchored into reality? And then they'll come out here, and many times these the Times and the Washington Post and others have dispatched reporters to come out here to the Midwest to go interview my constituents, to try to find somebody that actually can give them a narrative about what they've already been writing about me. And that they're not in tune with our way of life out here at all. But it didn't used to be that way, because kids even in the city grew up with a better anchor in reality. They weren't off in an elitist school and been pampered for a lifetime. So that's just a comment on that. That's a summation of my experience and interpretation of interactivity with who knows how many reporters over the years, quite a lot. By the way, I agree with what you say about small town. That's a lot more real, and I'm happier here, by the way.
You ended the 13th chapter of your book by saying, quote, the forces of amorality are motivated to eliminate Christianity, to remove all critics of their own wayward behavior. And I was just wondering, in that particular passage, who are those forces in your mind, those forces of amorality, as you call it?
Well, actually, I should have written more into that chapter on it. I know I touched on the Book of Wisdom in that piece, and the verses in the Book of Wisdom. I'll just give you one, and it is this Book of Wisdom predicts the crucifixion of Christ, and it says, "Let us beset the just one, for he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doing and charges us with violations of our training." Then it goes on with a similar theme for a few other verses. But then, so I look at that and I just make the pronouns plural. Let us beset the just ones, for they are obnoxious to us. And you can go down through that verse. But what it says is that the people who are living their lives in a way that is as clean as we mortals can, are an embodiment of the guilty conscience of the people that know they aren't. And there's forces of good and evil in this world. And it started at the Garden of Eden. And you can look at the godless Marxists that are out there. There's nothing just about what they are doing, except they're just trying to destroy Western civilization itself, as it turns out. And they are direct enemies of the Judeo-Christian values that are the foundation of Western civilization, this first world that we are. And so I see that. And another little narrative would be, as I was walking into the Capitol one day with former Congresswoman Marilyn Musgrave, trying to create an argument that I could use to convince the left to come over to the logical side of the policy issue. And she said, "You don't understand, do you, Steve? So the people you're trying to convince don't believe what you do. She said, you believe that you're a created being with a life after death, and they don't believe that. And you're trying to use your values to sway them, and that won't work." And she was probably right on that. And the very definition of Marx and Mao and Stalinist and Castro and the rest of them, the very definition is atheism. And so if you're godless, you're atheist, what are you going to anchor your morality to? And you only can anchor it to a dedication to the state, and those estates only interested in power. So I think we should be thinking in those terms. There's a morality, and that morality was existed and embodied within all of our founding fathers, all of our framers of the Constitution. And they made it real clear that if you don't have those values, that we cannot have a successful republic here. So I think that's just a given.
Is that a dangerous mindset to get into, though, that there are entire swaths of, and groups of people that are forces for evil, or that are out to fundamentally change things? Because isn't that a dangerous road to get down in certain cases? Because if you believe that, in some ways, the only natural conclusion to that is to fight back against that. And some people might take that in terms of a physical fight.
Well, I've never given up trying to convert them. And I've seen it happen to some degree. It's hard, very hard to do. But if you've got a heart for humanity, that's not a troubling thing at all. But what would be worse than that would be if we just simply decided, well, we're either going to be naive or feign that we're naive, and let these forces break apart and crumble the pillars of American exceptionalism. They will destroy this republic if we don't defend these values. And that's what I do. And I've made it, I don't know how many speeches about the pillars of American exceptionalism. I don't know that I went into great detail in the book, but freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, right to keep and bear arms, property rights, a jury of your peers, no double jeopardy, you can go on and on. Also free enterprise capitalism, Judeo-Christian values, and also the rule of law. All of those values are being assaulted now by the left, and they know what they're doing. They are attacking Western civilization. And I have been for years working to build an organization, international organization, that would restore Western civilization for the world. And some of the powers that be internationally knew that. And that was another component of this, but I didn't write about it in the book because it's too complex and we'd have gotten off on a tangent.
In pages 130 and 131, you mentioned a writer comparing some of your words about birth rates to that of neo-Nazi David Lane, who killed the Jewish radio host and actually is from Iowa. He's from Woden. You said about that part, we need to recognize these people like Hales, that was the writer, are as sick and as obsessed as the Lanes are. And I was wondering if that was a little bit of hyperbole, or were you comparing a writer condemning you to an actual neo-Nazi murderer?
Well, I wouldn't be doing that, and I wouldn't use that language as far as neo-Nazi as you expressed that. It was just a comparison to show people what's going on and to emphasize the important values that I want people to draw from this book.
Near the end of the book, in chapter 25, you talked about the U.S. Consistently ranking as one of the most generous nations in the world per the World Giving Index, and you said not only is English the language of business, it is the language of giving as well. And if I was looking at the same index correctly, and I over a number of years, and I don't have any reason to think that I got the wrong one, another country that popped up consistently in the upper echelons from year to year was actually Indonesia. And I was wondering about that because that's not a country where English is the main tongue and where Islam is the dominant religion. And so I'm curious what you make of that.
Well, think how much more generous they could be if they adopted English as their official language. That's what I would think. But, I don't have an explanation for that, and I don't know that data. I've never seen it that I remember. But I think we should go back and look at it as what's the percentage of the per capita income. And one of the things we don't talk about very much is the per capita GDP of our people. And that's where we need to keep America, is producing more per person. And that's what will keep us a prosperous nation. But, we've had very little trouble with Indonesians with regard to any kind of Muslim violence. They seem to be a very stable, moderate Muslim country, the highest population Muslim country in the world, I recognize, but seem to be very stable. And so that's, I don't have a criticism over there of the Indonesians, but I have great praise for what the English language has done. And I don't remember that I went very far into this, but there's a significant study that shows that the English language is the carrier of liberty, of freedom, and that other languages don't express it in an actual interpretive way. And so we should be thankful that English is the dominant language in America, and 30 some states have it as the official language, and the Anglophobe, which would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, of course, Great Britain. If I'm forgetting somebody, that's of course the United States, but that embodies most of a big part of the first world. And then, of course, the European Union adopted English as their language to do their deliberations in the European Parliament. So English has done, just the language itself, wherever it's gone, people have prospered. And that includes India and many of the countries in Africa. I think the Brits drove on the wrong side of the road, but if you go to Africa and look at the level of prosperity, this is just an observation, and I don't know any data that supports it, but I would be able to lay a wager down that in Africa that was colonized by multiple countries, the countries that drive on the left side of the road probably are more prosperous than those that drive on the other side of the road, because it's an indicator of the British put their system in place. And I've traveled in Africa significantly, and I've seen that from just being there.
So in that same chapter that I was just referencing, chapter 25, you talked about being in Africa. Specifically, you talked about the Miracle Kids in Tanzania, which seems to have left a major impression on you, because you said at one point in that chapter, if I am stricken by Alzheimer's and destined to lose my memories one at a time, let this cherished day in my memory be the last to go. And so I was wondering, have you kept in touch with those kids since all of that happened?
Yes, I have. And we brought them back in, it'd be the fall of 2018. And we did some 26 to 28 different events that I and my staff organized. Well, I probably should have been campaigning. We were doing fundraising events and thank you tours for the Tanzanian Miracle Kids. And so I wanted to just, be awash in that. I wanted to celebrate it. And they were so great appreciation for the United States. They know they wouldn't be alive today, and their families know that. And I think of Doreen, who was paralyzed from the waist down, and now she's out there playing soccer with her friends. And in Tanzania, if you're paralyzed, you don't have much hope at all. And as it is, and she's turned into this kind of impish little practical joker that I get a real kick out of. And then Wilson, he was a fellow that never stopped smiling. And I started looking for pictures. I didn't find all the pictures. I thought that have him smiling, but that's the way we always remember him as. So yes, I've stayed in touch with him, and then, but most of it now has been through Dr. Steve Meyer, who I believe right now is probably still in Tanzania. And I want to make sure that, people know that he was a linchpin, and without him, and if I didn't know how determined he is, I don't think I would have had the determination myself to be able to follow through and help facilitate the saving of their lives. But I do know that Dr. Meyer stood in front of those kids at least 2 events with a lot of witnesses. And he said, if it weren't for Steve King, these kids would be dead today.
What specific lessons did you learn from interacting with them and hearing their stories?
Well, I think the part that was the most impressive was the terrific rollout, the terrific welcome that they had at Kilimanjaro Airport. Several thousand there in their Sunday best, and the choir that had been writing songs throughout the summer and to welcome those kids back home again. And I was able to speak to several hundred at a time. And some of the school there, Steve Meyer had set up for the school. I met all the kids at the orphanage, I saw the farm. And what I saw was interacting with thousands of them, and that 3 hours on the tarmac with several thousand there, and it was all centered on those kids and we that were part of that entourage. And so what I saw was joy and appreciation and friendliness, and I didn't see a hostile look or see a hostile position of anybody. It was all in gratitude and joy. And the kids in the school, and I gave a little speech to them too, and all their faces were saying the things that they should have been saying. They were all listening. They were reacting to what was said, and you could just see that good things were happening there. And a lot of it has to do with Steve Meyer and the effort he's done with STEM. But I don't know that's when you deal with the Congressional Black Caucus and you go over there and you're treated like that, you really, really appreciate the people in Tanzania.
I mentioned earlier on that you called Representative Feenstra an off-the-shelf state senator, and you kind of questioned the timing of him getting into the race as a bit suspect. And so I'm wondering, now that he's been a congressman for a year or so, how do you think he's done as a representative for you and myself as well, because we both live in his
Well, I don't know what he's doing. I don't see that he's taking a lead on anything. I presume he's voting. I don't have any question about that, actually. But, I always took positions, and people knew where I stood. I would get informed. I would listen to both sides as many times as I could, and I take a position. So if you don't take a position, if you duck the issues, then what you're doing is you're really stealing people's trust and time. So you have to go around behind and find out, well, what's he really going to do? What's going to happen here? And by the way, we need leaders. And I'm not seeing the leaders emerge either. Now they'll say he's in the minority. Well, I've been on both sides of that, and I stepped up and took the lead regardless. But here's one of these things now that I would say that we need to hear from our congressman on this, and that is the carbon capture pipelines that they're trying to push through Northwest Iowa and on through the state. There's a lot of information that's hard to find on that. And what's his position? Is he going to be there advocating for it? This is, a couple of his benefactors are the leading on it. Terry Branstad and Bruce Rastetter are the lead. And we know where they were in this primary race. And so does that mean that he doesn't have the objective judgment to step in on this because of that? What I'll say is this, that I want to know a lot more about that. I want to look at the business model and see how this thing all flows out. And that was one of the things I'd like to know. I'd like to hear from my congressman. What's your stand on that? Is it good or bad? What are the pros and cons? And how do you evaluate? I just posed that question out there as one. And the rest of them, my sense is that if there's a herd there, then the center of that herd is the safest place. And if you're out to the edge, that's when you start making news. I'm not hearing any news from Randy Feenstra. None.
Have you talked with him at all as a constituent or as a former representative of the same district?
Say again, Jared. Sorry.
Have you talked with Mr. Feenstra at all?
No, we haven't had a conversation since primary night when I called him.
And who are some current politicians, first at the state level and then nationally, who have impressed you in recent times?
Well, if I start telling those names out there, somebody's going to use it against them. So I don't want to hurt those people that are doing a good job. But let me just say, generally speaking, in the Iowa Senate, I think they're a terrific bunch. And this last couple of general assemblies and this one that's existing now, you've got a really good group of people they're serious. They've got good work ethics, and they've got a good, solid set of values. And so I'm a cheerleader for them, all of them there. And then on the House side, it's not as easy. There's 100 instead of 50, and it's tougher for them to get the things through. But I'm very, very happy with the state senator I have and the state representative that I have. And the redistricting shook up some of this, and it's going to cost some talent out of the state Senate. But Iowa's governance right now it's very, very good, and I'm far more pleased with the conduct of it than I have been in past years. At the national level, it's hard to find a leader there, and they've been cowed to Kevin McCarthy. And so McCarthy's controlling their fundraising, their committee assignments, any bills that might move, their foreign travel. He's got a string tied to everything, and then he uses the carrot and the stick to get his way. And I never envisioned a Congress that should run like that. I think it's completely wrong. The job of a leader is to bring out the will of the group, and the members in the group, which I was for 18 years, our job is to go out across the district at as many public events as we can, take as many messages as possible, use our staff out there as eyes and ears, and then bring the very best ideas from the 4th District of Iowa to Congress and let them compete with the other best ideas. That doesn't happen very well if you have to always be kissing the requisite amount of backside.
Near the very end of the book, on page 231, you shared a prayer that you say every day, asking God to help use the day to glorify Him as much as possible. And I was kind of curious, do you think that all these controversies that we've talked about and all of the occasions of, going back and forth with politicians and, calling them, devious or evil, do you think that glorifies Him as much as possible?
I would say go back and read the section in the New Testament about righteous anger. And that would be when Christ formed a whip and drove the money changers out of the temple. Once you understand that, then you understand that the people that are destroying our republic, that are chiseling away at the pillars of American exceptionalism, need to be confronted. And if nice words don't do it, plain spoken, blunt words have been demonstrated to do it. But there's nothing that I have written or said about any of these people that is anywhere near what they have written and said about me. It happens to be that my words are true and theirs are not anchored in anything. There's not a single fact that is documented in all of the attacks on me. And there's not a single individual that has made an allegation from a first person perspective that they've been disrespected by me. And that's important that people know that. As much as the reporters have searched, the people that I've been in the same place here for all my life, and our friends and neighbors and business in many of the counties around here from King Construction, we're in our 46th or 47th year now, and they still can't come up with a single narrative that illustrates the allegations that they have made. And so let's see. So I don't have any first person allegations. They don't have any facts to deal with here, but I have written the objective truth in a chronological way so people can understand it. And if they can't accept the truth about themselves written one time after they poured all these things on me that are false, I think that's on them, not on me.
What's a criticism of yourself that you've heard that is fair or that is true?
None. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can come up with something, but I'm so for a number of years now, they've manufactured stories. They've taken things out of context. They've embellished things that didn't have any substance to embellish, and it's been a constant barrage of this because they're trying to muzzle me. And if people can read this book and not understand that, I would be stunned.
And just to be clear, who is the they you're referring to in those instances?
That would be, of course, all of the forces on the left, but on the Republican side, it would be the elitists, the establishment, the never Trumpers, the globalists, those folks that are part of the structure that trades leadership back and forth in Washington and across the country and in the states that are interested in staying in power. And the folks that were part of this system that decided that they were going to deny the people in the 4th District the representative that they had chosen in the election in 2018. That's I don't know that I would have never believed that this could ever happen if I hadn't lived through it. And even when I wrote it, I still sat back and I thought, my gosh, there's of the names that are here that I had to write in order to tell the narrative. I'm still surprised that there wasn't a single statesman in the bunch that would have spoken up and picked up their phone and called me on the cell. Every one of them had my cell number, and not one of them asked me for the truth.
And what when you say globalist, what or who do you consider a globalist?
Well, they're the people that sometimes they're playing into the hands of the globalists, but they're the ones that are they're undermining our sovereignty, that they're trading out our national security, our manufacturing over to China, for one thing. The national security component that has been a lot of that sold over to China. Those that do things to break down our borders and to destroy our sovereignty, open borders people are globalists almost by definition. And so each move that gets made is one that is a strong indicator of globalism, whether they know what they're doing, whether it's a plan out of Davos, Switzerland, or whether it's somebody that just happens to pick up on the initiatives and the leadership of others. But they contribute to breaking down our national sovereignty, our nation state, and those principles that are the foundation for America. And that's the globalists. Anybody that's against the nation state, the most successful institution over the last 2 centuries or more is the nation state. And if you're breaking down the nation state, erasing borders, and sacrificing our national security, then you're a globalist in one form or another.
Do you have any reservations using that particular term? Because, I've seen just one example of someone who uses that same language quite a bit, especially globalist. It's a favorite of his. Is Alex Jones, who is someone, if people don't know, among other things, said that Sandy Hook was faked. And I'm just wondering if you have reservations using those sort of phrases when they're stock and trade of folks that are pretty noxious people.
Well, when you get to the point where you're asking a question like that, if I use the same word that somebody else used and then associate the ideology together and call one obnoxious, that's some of the problems we have in this country today. Whenever it's the message that matters, not the messenger. Listen carefully to the message and read the words that put it within the context of the conversation or the writing that's there. But I would say this, Jared, never, ever associate someone because their words might have matched, or even one word matched, because you cannot tie somebody else's ideology together. It's the message, not the messenger. And I say this as emphatically as I do because that happened to me more than once. It happened to me a lot of times, but I can think of one where there was a story that was posted on Twitter that had it said that it was that 65% of the young Italians had too much immigration and they wanted to shut down the flow of immigration in Italy. That 65% of them did. Well, I agreed with that story and I looked at it. It was a Breitbart framework. And so I just retweeted it. Well, it turned out that it had been tweeted by somebody that in England that I'd never heard of, had known nothing about him. And so the people out there started attacking me saying I needed to take that down because after all, it was written by somebody that they had a lot of pejorative terms for. I ended up on CNN and Chris Cuomo and I going back and forth on this. And I said, first of all, is just look at the message. And I said, it's a message, not the messenger. And I'm going to stick with that. That's the right way to analyze it. And then of all the other associations, you can never escape that. If that's going to be a legitimate way to assign somebody, he used the same word as this other person, therefore they have the same ideology. No one could escape those allegations. It'd be impossible. The message, not the messenger.
Shouldn't the messenger matter in certain circumstances, though? Like the guy you mentioned with that the Breitbart retweet, and I think you did name check him in the book. Mark Collett is his name, and among other things, he said that pornography was a Jewish plot to destroy Christian families. And so I'm wondering, I do understand this parsing of message and messenger. But in certain circumstances, shouldn't people be paying attention to who that messenger is too?
I don't think it's valid at all. What I say, I stand up for. What somebody else says, I'm not accountable for that. And I don't remember that his name was in my book. I'd be surprised if it was. it's not really in my memory until you say it. So you must have done some decent research on that to look that up.
And then I'm curious, what's future? Because I know you stopped here in December at the Rotary Club to talk about the book. What further plans do you have for it at this point?
Well, later today, I'm going to do a book signing at a library by invitation, and there's multiple media outlets now that are asking me to be there. So that's on Monday. I'll be doing a television program, an internet program down out of there on Monday, along with another stop or two. So I'm out there promoting my book, selling it, and my objective is to get that out in as many people's hands as possible. I want them to read it and understand it, so that they understand what the real thing is going on in politics, and that if we are going to be a viable country, we need to clean ourselves up and reduce the system that we have and turn it back into we the people. That's always been my objective, and I want to make sure I get that message out. And I will say this, that Kevin McCarthy, he's looking to be the Speaker of the House, and I think I wrote in there that is his objective, and it prevails over any other issue. So it's always a calculation for him. What does it help him get closer to being Speaker? Does it move him away from that? And that's what his moves are. And he would be pretty close to the last person that I would vote for if I had the choice.
Outside of the book, what other plans do you have for the future? Do you have any plans to re-engage with politics anyway? What do you have lined up outside of the book?
Well, I'm helping candidates now as we move towards a primary process, and I intend to continue doing that. I've got some stops to make along the way to touch bases, and I'll be rolling out some endorsements also at the request of some candidates. So we'll see how that thing goes. But I just finished taping the audio book here, and it should be being shipped off today as it is. That has ground up to about 2 weeks. It's a lot harder than, it's at least as hard as they told me it was. It's a lot harder than I expected. But then I'm going to keep moving, and all the things that I can do to help inform people, educate them, recruit candidates at all the levels that I've said, from the library board all the way on up to Congress. I want people to step forward that have a solid set of values and take public roles so that we can get America functioning the way it was designed by our founders.
You mentioned in the book that you're kind of a fast talker. So when you were recording the audiobook, did you have to slow down a little bit and catch yourself?
I did have to slow down. And I listened to, my wife listens to a lot of audio books, so I listened to the pace there. And then I shifted myself into that as much as I could. And I didn't get the advice that I should slow down after the product was out. And I floated it out to several of my top critics, and I just did a chapter. And they were the people that were telling me, don't even try this because it's a lot harder than you think. Plus, my publisher told me it was a lot harder than I thought. And of course, he was right. But once I did that one chapter, they said, no, this is good. This is a 95 to 100% deal. Go for it. And so I did, and I'm satisfied with the work we have, but I'll leave it to the critics that listen to it fresh because I'm so deeply steeped in it. It's hard to be objective.
Sure. Well, those were all of the questions that I had. Is there, I always make sure to ask this, Journalism 101. Is there anything in particular I might have missed that you want to just make sure to speak to before I let you go?
Well, I'd only say this, that, that the book is available only at my website, steveking.com. And while I'm sitting here right now, I'm packaging books and sending them out. That's another thing that keeps me occupied, sometimes way into the night. But they need to know that is how to access the book. And I will personally autograph each one of them that come out of here. And if I recognize their name, I will personalize it. So there's that. But I really want them to know, I want them also to know that I'm not, as I said earlier, there's no sour grapes written in this book. It's not in my head or my heart. I have a fulfilling life. I'm surrounded by 8 grandchildren and 16 of us all together in the extended nuclear family that we are. I see the sunrise out of my east deck and the sunset out of my west deck, and I wake up in the morning expecting to actually be in my own home for the first time in a long, long time. So I'm engaged in this, and the electronics make it so much better than it might have been. So I'm leading a fulfilling life here, and if I write another book, it'll be about Western civilization. I think we need to raise that up and make it, restore it for the world.
Thank you so much for your time. This is going to be coming out next week, I believe, is what my editor was telling me. And I'm sure it'll take a little bit of time to compress this video down since this interview went for about an hour or so. But thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
You bet. I'm glad to do it. Thanks. I know you paid attention too. I want to tell you that. You did your homework. So you deserve some credit on that for sure.
Thanks,
Jared.
Take care.
You bet. You too. Bye.